The snow had stopped falling over Borcy sometime before midnight, and Hasso von Manteuffel was standing over a field table in the dark, reading a situation report by the light of a shielded lamp, when the number on the page stopped him cold. The figure was not wrong. He checked it again. It was not wrong. It was December 19th, 1944, and the American 101st Airborne Division, a unit his intelligence staff had last placed in a rest area near Reims, more than 100 miles to the southwest, was already inside Bastogne, not approaching, not staging, inside the perimeter, digging in, organizing a defense. The timestamp on the report indicated they had begun arriving the previous evening, which meant the Americans had loaded, moved, and closed on Bastogne in somewhere between 16 and 18 hours from the moment the offensive began. Manteuffel had planned for 3 days minimum. His entire operational sequence, the bypass routes, the Meuse crossing windows, the fuel allocations for his panzer columns, was built on 3 days. The Americans had done it in less than one. Not the lead elements, the division. Trucks crowding the roads south of Bastogne through the freezing dark. Men without winter gear riding open vehicles at speed through country that was actively being contested, closing a gap that by every measurement Manteuffel trusted should have been impossible to close that fast. He would later describe it in those exact terms, not as a tactical setback, as something that violated the internal logic of the war he understood himself to be fighting. The question that stayed with him, that he never fully resolved, was not how they moved that quickly. The question was what else his planning framework had gotten wrong, and for how long. Part 1. The Doctrine of the Impossible Timetable. The German operational art that produced Manteuffel was built on a specific assumption about enemy armies. The assumption was not that enemy armies were slow. The assumption was that all armies, every army, German included, were constrained by the same iron mathematics of logistics. Men need fuel, tanks need fuel and ammunition. Artillery needs shells by the ton. And all of it has to move on roads, through choke points, across bridges, in a sequence that can be predicted, modelled, and disrupted. This was not arrogance. This was engineering. The Wehrmacht's planning staff, the Operationsabteilung, had spent decades refining the science of what they called Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, and its companion concept, the operational pause. Every army, they understood, has a rhythm. It attacks, it advances, it outpaces its supply lines, and then it stops, involuntarily, not by choice, while logistics catch up. The art of German operational planning was to strike during the enemy's pause, or to force the pause early by threatening the supply lines directly. This framework had worked in Poland in 1939. It had worked in France in 1940 spectacularly. It had worked in the opening months of Barbarossa in 1941, where entire Soviet army groups collapsed before they could consolidate. And it had taught the Germans something they took as a law of nature. A strategic reserve, a division, a corps, cannot be moved from its rest area to a crisis point in less than a minimum number of days. You need orders to filter down through the chain of command. You need fuel allocations. You need road march coordination. You need units to load onto trucks or trains, move to a staging area, unload, reorganize, and then make a tactical approach to the front. A full division moving under combat conditions, in winter, over Belgian roads, from 100 miles away. 3 days minimum, probably 4 or 5. Manteuffel built his entire operational concept for the Ardennes offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, on this assumption. His 5th Panzer Army's mission was to break through the American front in the center, bypass the road hub of Bastogne, cross the Meuse River between Namur and Dinant, and swing north toward Antwerp in a pincer with Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army to the north. The whole concept depended on speed, reaching the Meuse before the Allies could concentrate enough force to stop him. He had done the math. The nearest substantial American reserves were the 82nd Airborne Division and the 101st Airborne Division, both resting and refitting near Reims, France, approximately 160 kilometers from Bastogne. Standard Wehrmacht calculation said those divisions could not be combat effective at Bastogne in less than 72 hours after the order to move, probably longer given winter roads, night movement, and the disorganization that follows a surprise attack. 72 hours. That was the window. Get his panzers through the gap, bypass Bastogne, reach the Meuse, and the American reserves would arrive to find him already gone. Hold that calculation, because what actually happened was something the German planning staff would later describe in captured documents and post-war interviews as outside the boundaries of what they had considered possible. Now let's talk about the machine that proved them wrong. Part 2. The army that moved at the speed of a man who had been waiting his entire life for this. Meet General George Smith Patton Jr., born November 11, 1885, in San Gabriel, California. 59 years old in December of 1944. Commander of the United States Third Army, the force responsible for the American front to the south of the Ardennes, in Luxembourg and northeastern France. Patton is one of the most documented figures in the history of the American military, which means the myths about him are almost as thick as the records. Strip the myths away, and what you find is something more interesting than the legend. A man who had spent 40 years thinking about exactly this kind of problem. How do you move an army faster than the enemy thinks possible? He had been asking that question since before most of his subordinates were born. At West Point, where he graduated in 1909, in the Pancho Villa expedition of 1916, where he led what became one of the first American military actions using motor vehicles, and understood immediately that the combustion engine had changed the mathematics of military movement forever. In France during the First World War, where he commanded the American Tank School and was wounded near the front, and where he began developing the doctrinal ideas about armoured warfare that would define his career. During the interwar years, while the army shrank and funding dried up, and most officers went back to cavalry horses and peacetime routine, Patton kept thinking. He was a central figure in developing the Army's armoured warfare doctrine. He commanded the 2nd Armoured Division when America entered the war, he led the 7th Army in the Mediterranean, and by the time he took command of 3rd Army after the Normandy invasion in June of 1944, he had distilled everything he had learned into a single operational principle that his staff understood viscerally. Speed is a weapon, not a byproduct of success, a weapon itself. The army that moves faster than the enemy can think is the army that wins before the battle is even joined. His staff had internalized this. They had built Third Army's logistics around it. They had run exercises around it. They had developed contingency plans, not for specific scenarios, but for categories of scenarios, so that when an unexpected crisis arose, the staff was not starting from scratch. They were pulling a pre-built framework off the shelf and filling in the blanks. And then, on December 16, 1944, at approximately 5:30 in the morning, the unexpected crisis arrived. Manteuffel's guns opened up across the Schnee Eifel. Within hours, it was clear this was not a spoiling attack or a local counteroffensive. The Germans were punching through the center of the Allied line with everything they had. By the afternoon of December 16th, Patton's intelligence officer, Brigadier General Oscar Koch, 45 years old, a former banker from St. Louis, Missouri, methodical to the point of obsession, had already briefed Patton on what he assessed was coming. Koch was one of the few Allied intelligence officers who had not been caught entirely by surprise. He had been tracking the build-up of German forces opposite the Ardennes for weeks, and while he could not say with certainty what it meant, he had flagged it as a potential threat. Stop and think about that. While SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, and most of the Allied command were still processing the shock of the German attack on December 16th, Patton's staff was already 3 moves ahead. Because here is what Patton did that afternoon. He called his 3 corps commanders into his office. He told them to be prepared to stop whatever they were currently doing and turn 90 degrees north. He did not wait for orders from above. He did not wait for the situation to clarify. He told his staff to begin preparing 3 separate operational plans, 3 different axes of advance, 3 different force packages, so that when the order came, they could execute immediately. He was, in effect, preloading the response. The order came on December 18th. General Dwight Eisenhower convened a conference at Verdun, France. The Allied commanders gathered to discuss how to respond to the German breakthrough. Eisenhower asked Patton how long it would take him to disengage Third Army from its current offensive operations and attack north toward Bastogne. Patton said 48 hours. The room went quiet. Several officers laughed. Not mockingly, they simply did not believe it was physically possible. An army of 250,000 men currently engaged in offensive operations along a different axis entirely, turning 90 degrees and attacking in a new direction in 48 hours. In December, in Belgium, Patton was not bluffing. He picked up the phone in the conference room and called his chief of staff. The orders had already been drafted. The movement was already beginning. Here is the forensic detail that matters. When Patton said 48 hours, his lead elements, the 4th Armoured Division, under Major General Hugh Gaffey, were already moving. Not preparing to move, moving. Trucks were on the roads. Fuel was being allocated. Route coordination was happening in real time. The 4th Armoured Division had begun its road march before the Verdun Conference ended. This is the thing Manteuffel could not have modelled, because it violated every assumption his planning framework was built on. Patton had not waited for the order to move. He had anticipated the order and pre-positioned his response. The 72-hour window that German operational planning had calculated as the minimum response time was not 72 hours. It was, effectively, already closed by the time Manteuffel's panzers were crossing the Our River. Now let's look at what actually happened on the roads of Belgium and what it cost both sides. Part 3. The roads in December. People have written millions of words about the Battle of the Bulge. Most of those words focus on Bastogne, the siege, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, the famous one-word reply to the German surrender demand. And Bastogne matters. But to understand why Manteuffel's concession carries the weight it does, you need to look at something less dramatic: the roads. Specifically, what happened on the roads of Belgium and Luxembourg between December 17th and December 26th, 1944. The 101st Airborne Division was resting near Mourmelon-le-Grand, France, approximately 160 kilometers from Bastogne. The division had just come out of brutal fighting in the Netherlands during Operation Market Garden. Its men were exhausted. Many of them were without their full equipment. Its commanding general, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington for a conference. The division was, by any standard military assessment, not ready for immediate commitment to combat. On the night of December 17th to 18th, the 101st loaded onto open trucks, not heated transport vehicles, open trucks, and drove through freezing temperatures in the dark toward Bastogne. The trucks had no heaters. The men had no winter overcoats. Those had not yet been issued. Many of them did not know where they were going until they were already on the road. They covered 160 kilometers in approximately 17 hours. Read that line again. A division of approximately 11,000 men, without its commanding general, without full equipment, in open vehicles in winter temperatures, covered 160 kilometers and arrived at Bastogne on December 18th, establishing a defensive perimeter before the German panzers closed the ring around the town. Manteuffel's operational plan had assumed this was impossible. Not unlikely, impossible. The German planning calculation for moving a division from a rest area to a crisis point factored in the time needed for unit assembly, order dissemination, road coordination, vehicle preparation, and approach march. Even under ideal conditions, the Wehrmacht's own doctrine said this took a minimum of 48 to 72 hours from the moment the order was issued. The 101st did it in 17 hours from the moment the trucks arrived. Now add the 4th Armoured Division. Meet Lieutenant Colonel Crichton Williams Abrams Jr., 29 years old in December of 1944, from Agawam, Massachusetts, a graduate of West Point, class of 1940, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armoured Division. Abrams is not the most famous figure in the story of the Bulge. He will become famous later. He will give his name to the M1 Abrams tank, the main battle tank of the United States Army for the next half-century. But in December of 1944, He is a lieutenant colonel commanding a battalion of Sherman tanks, and he is about to do something that German operational planners would spend years trying to explain. Patton's 4th Armoured Division received its orders to move north on December 18th. It had been attacking eastward in the Saar region, turning a full armoured division 90 degrees, reorienting its supply lines, its maintenance trains, its artillery support, its infantry attachments is not a simple administrative act. It requires hours of coordination under normal circumstances. Patton's armoured spearhead did it while moving. By December 22nd, Abrams's 37th Tank Battalion was the lead element of the relief column pushing north toward Bastogne through the German ring. The roads were iced. German anti-tank guns were dug in across every viable approach route. The weather was below freezing. Abrams's tanks were taking fire from 3 directions simultaneously. He kept moving. On December 26th, 10 days after the German offensive began, Abrams's battalion broke through the German encirclement south of Bastogne and linked up with the defenders inside the town. The siege was broken. 10 days. From the opening of the German offensive to the relief of Bastogne, 10 days. Manteuffel had planned for a window of 72 hours before significant American reserves could arrive. He had assumed that window would be enough to bypass Bastogne and push his panzers to the Meuse. Instead, Bastogne was defended before he could encircle it properly, and it was relieved before he could reduce it. The window he had calculated did not exist. What elevates this beyond the logistical footnote is where the blame actually landed. In post-war interviews and in his memoir contributions to the collected German accounts of the battle, Manteuffel did not blame the weather. He did not blame the failure of Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army to make progress in the north. He did not blame Hitler's interference with the operational plan. He identified the speed of the American response as the decisive factor, and he said explicitly that the speed exceeded what he had calculated as possible. That concession is extraordinary. Manteuffel was not a man given to excuses or self-exculpation. He was precise, analytical, and honest in his professional assessments. When he said the Americans moved faster than he thought possible, he was not offering a polite explanation for his defeat. He was identifying a genuine failure in his analytical framework, a gap between what his model of enemy behavior predicted and what the enemy actually did. That gap had a name, and the name was not Bastogne. The name was not the 101st Airborne. The name was the system that Patton had spent 40 years building. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what the Battle of the Bulge actually turned on, not the version that lives in the mythology of the frozen paratroopers, but the version that lives in the operational mathematics of truck movements and staff work done before the crisis arrived, press the like button. It keeps this kind of forensic history visible a little longer, and that matters. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. That evidence points to a forensic verdict for this investigation. Hasso von Manteuffel did not lose the Battle of the Bulge because his men fought poorly. They fought exceptionally. He did not lose it because the plan was fundamentally misconceived, though Hitler's insistence on objectives far beyond what was operationally achievable was a compounding problem. He lost it at the decisive operational level because his planning framework contained an assumption about American logistics that was systematically wrong. The assumption was reasonable by the standards of every army Manteuffel had studied and fought against. German armies moved fast. Russian armies in 1944 were moving faster than anyone had expected, but they were moving along established axes with established supply lines. No army in the Second World War had demonstrated the ability to pivot a major formation 90 degrees in winter against a ticking clock and execute at full combat effectiveness within 48 hours. Patton's Third Army did it, and the reason it could do it was not genius. It was preparation. What separates Patton's response from improvisation is timing. Patton did not invent the response to the Bulge on December 16th. He had been building the capability for that response for months. Third Army's logistics system, its truck allocation, its fuel dumps, Its road march protocols had been designed around the principle that the army might need to move fast in an unexpected direction. His staff had been drilled on contingency planning. Oscar Koch's intelligence shop had been flagging the Ardennes build-up as a potential threat when everyone else was dismissing it. When the crisis came, Patton was not adapting to it. He was executing a pre-built response. This is the thing Manteuffel's planning framework could not model, because no planning framework models for an enemy who has already anticipated the scenario. German operational planning was built around the assumption that an enemy army, caught by surprise, would require time to process the shock, issue orders, coordinate movement, and begin executing. That assumption was correct for every army the Germans had faced in the first 4 years of the war. It was not correct for Third Army in December of 1944, because Third Army had not been caught by surprise in the relevant sense. The tactical surprise was complete. The men in the foxholes in the Ardennes did not know the attack was coming. But the operational response was not built in the hours after the attack. It was built in the weeks and months before it, by a staff that had been told to assume the unexpected would happen and to be ready for it before it did. Think about what that means. The German attack achieved total tactical surprise, and the American response was still faster than German planning thought possible. Not because the Americans were not surprised, because surprise at the tactical level did not translate into paralysis at the operational level. The system was designed to function even when the forward elements were shocked and disorganized. That is not luck. That is doctrine. There is a second layer to Manteuffel's concession that deserves examination. When he said the Americans moved too fast, he was also implicitly acknowledging something about the American military system that German planners had consistently underestimated throughout the war: the relationship between American logistical capacity and American operational flexibility. The Wehrmacht's logistics system was, by 1944, severely degraded. Fuel was chronically short. The truck park had been depleted by years of attrition. The rail network in Germany was under constant Allied bombing. When German commanders planned an operation, they were planning within tight constraints. They knew exactly how much fuel they had, how many trucks were available, how many hours of movement that translated into. The constraints were real and inflexible. American logistics in December of 1944 were not operating under the same constraints. Third Army had access to the Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that had been moving supplies from the Normandy beaches to the front since August. It had fuel reserves. It had trucks. When Patton said he could move in 48 hours, he was not making an optimistic estimate. He was stating a fact about what his logistics system could actually do. Manteuffel had modeled the American response using German logistical assumptions. He had assumed that the Americans, like the Wehrmacht, were operating close to their logistical limits, that there was no slack in the system, no reserve capacity that could be instantly mobilized. That assumption was wrong. Third Army had slack. It had been deliberately built into the system by a commander who understood that operational flexibility requires logistical reserves, not just combat reserves. Pause on that. The extra trucks, the extra fuel, the pre-planned contingency orders. None of those things showed up in German intelligence assessments. None of them were visible at the tactical level. They were invisible until the moment they weren't, and 160 kilometers of Belgian road disappeared under the tracks of a division that wasn't supposed to be there yet. Now look at the human cost of Manteuffel's miscalculation, because that is where the abstraction becomes real. The Battle of the Bulge, from December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945, produced approximately 75,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. German casualties are estimated at approximately 67,000 to 100,000, though the precise figures remain contested. Belgian civilian casualties added to the toll. The town of Bastogne was heavily damaged. Entire villages in the Ardennes were destroyed. Many of those casualties on both sides were produced by the gap between Manteuffel's calculation and reality. If the American reserves had moved at the speed his model predicted, the battle's shape would have been entirely different. Bastogne might have fallen. The Meuse might have been reached. The winter of 1944 to 45 might have looked very different for the soldiers on both sides. They didn't move at the speed his model predicted. They moved faster. And the cost of that speed, paid by the men in open trucks in the freezing dark, by the paratroopers defending a perimeter without winter coats, by Abrams's tankers fighting through iced roads under fire from 3 directions, was real. It was paid in frostbite and blood and men who did not come home. But it was also decisive. The German offensive, which Hitler had designed to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace in the West, was stopped before it reached the Meuse. The window Manteuffel had calculated did not exist. The reserves arrived. The line held. Let's talk about what happened to the men in this story after the guns stopped. Hasso von Manteuffel survived the war. He was captured by American forces and held as a prisoner of war until 1947. After his release, he entered West German politics, served in the Bundestag, and spent years contributing to the scholarly study of the Second World War through interviews and written accounts, including the honest assessments of his own errors that formed the foundation of this investigation. He died in September of 1978 at the age of 83. He is buried in Neuss, Germany. George Patton did not survive long enough to see the peace. He commanded Third Army through the final months of the war in Europe, driving east at the pace that had become his signature. After the German surrender, he was reassigned, controversially, after public statements about denazification policy that infuriated Schaeff. On December 9, 1945, he was involved in a traffic accident near Mannheim, Germany. He died 12 days later, on December 21, 1945. He was 59 years old. He is buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery near the men of Third Army he commanded, his own request to be buried with his soldiers. He had been born on November 11, 1885. He died on December 21, 1945. In between those dates, he had competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, finishing 5th overall, and, characteristically, arguing for the rest of his life that he had been scored incorrectly on the shooting event and should have placed higher. He had designed the M1913 cavalry sabre, which bore his name. He had fought in 2 world wars and 1 punitive expedition. And in 48 hours, in December of 1944, he had moved an army in a way that a brilliant German general later said was faster than he thought possible. Creighton Abrams went on to command American forces in Vietnam, serving as MAC V commander from 1968 to 1972. He died in office in September of 1974 as Army Chief of Staff at the age of 59. The M1 Abrams tank, which entered service in 1980 and remains the primary battle tank of the United States Army, bears his name. In December of 1944, he was a 29-year-old lieutenant colonel from Agawam, Massachusetts, pushing his Sherman tanks through iced roads toward a town that was supposed to be unreachable. Oscar Koch, the intelligence officer who had been tracking the German build-up and briefing Patton before most of the Allied command understood what was happening, retired from the army as a brigadier general. He died in 1970. His assessments in the weeks before the German offensive represent one of the few genuine intelligence successes on the Allied side in the Bulge, a success that is largely invisible in the popular history of the battle because it did not prevent the attack. It only enabled the response. And the response was the thing. That is the forensic conclusion. Return to December 16, 1944. Manteuffel in the dark before dawn, listening to his artillery. He has done the math. He has walked the lines. He has planned with the precision that made him one of the finest operational commanders in the German army. He has calculated the window, 72 hours minimum before significant American reserves can arrive. He was not careless. He was not arrogant. He was wrong. He was wrong because the army he was attacking had been built by a man who had spent 40 years thinking about exactly this problem to be wrong about. Patton had not built Third Army to fight well. He had built it to fight faster than the enemy thought possible. And when the moment came, when the crisis arrived and the clock started, the machine worked exactly as it had been designed to work. Manteuffel would say it himself later. Too fast. The Americans moved too fast. He was right. They did. The question worth sitting with, the one that outlasts the battle itself, is what it means that the decisive factor in one of the largest land battles in American military history was not firepower, not terrain, not weather, not the famous courage of the men in the foxholes. It was staff work done weeks before the crisis. Contingency plans drafted before anyone knew there would be a crisis. Logistical slack built into a system by a commander who understood that the armies that win are the ones that have already prepared for the moment when everything goes wrong at once. Patton never stopped moving, not in 1912 in Stockholm, not in 1916 in Mexico, not in the mud of France in 1917, not in the frozen roads of Belgium in 1944. He understood something that Manteuffel's planning framework could not accommodate. The enemy does not always behave the way the model says it should. And the only answer to that is to build a system that works faster than the model predicts, and then to have it ready before you need it. Too fast. 3 words. Manteuffel's concession. The honest verdict of a professional soldier on the thing that beat him. It is the most important operational lesson of the entire campaign, and it was delivered not in a victory speech or a post-war memoir written to settle scores. It was delivered by the man who lost, precisely because he was honest enough to say it. If this investigation gave you something new, press the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember, the armies that win are rarely the ones that fought hardest in the moment. They are the ones that prepared most carefully for the moment before it arrived. Too fast.